Congresswoman Crockett, Judge Amy Coney Barrett's voice sliced through the chamber, sharp as a blade. You sit here parading yourself as a defender of the Constitution, but in truth, you represent nothing more than noise, empty rhetoric. Dressed up as principle, the words hung heavy in the courtroom, echoing against the marble walls. Cameras clicked in bursts, their flashes lighting the tense faces of those seated behind the oak benches. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering, as though the oxygen in the room had been stolen away. Barrett's expression was stone, her chin lifted, her robe falling around her like a curtain of authority. She had delivered attacks before, but never with such pointed disdain. Across the chamber, Jasmine Crockett did not move. Flinch didn't frown, and didn't even blink too quickly. She sat upright, shoulders steady, eyes calm, so calm, it unnerved even those who were rooting for her downfall. For a moment, it looked as if Barrett had landed a blow that would define the day, as though the gavel of judgment had already struck. Whispers broke out in the gallery. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smirked, nodding, as though Barrett had spoken a universal truth. Divide in the room mirrored the divide across America, those who cheered the arrogance of power, and those who longed for someone to stand tall against it. Yet Jasmine remained still. Her silence was not weakness, it was presence. A storm gathering strength behind unshaken eyes. Every camera swung toward her, desperate for a flicker of reaction. Every reporter's pulse quickened, knowing history could shift with her next breath. Barrett pressed on, her voice dripping with scorn. Your arguments crumble under scrutiny. Your positions reveal inexperience. I should be grateful you've even been allowed a seat in this chamber. She leaned forward, punctuating the last word with the weight of centuries of condescension. The chamber fell silent. Time seemed to slow, the seconds stretching longer than they should. On Jasmine Crockett, would she shrink? Would she stumble? Would she let the insult carve into her reputation? No. She lifted her chin ever so slightly, her lips curling into the faintest trace of a smile, not defiant, control. And in that silent control, the balance of power began to shift. But Jasmine's reply would flip the trial upside down. 4 months leading up to this trial, America had been watching. Not just because of the legal questions on the docket, but because the courtroom had become something larger, a stage where two visions of the country clashed. On one side stood Judge Amy Coney Barrett, draped not only in the authority of her robe, but also in years of being treated as untouchable. To her supporters, she was the embodiment of traditional power, a figure who carried the weight of history, precedent, and privilege. She had silenced challengers before, cutting them down with carefully sharpened words, and walked away unscathed. Her name alone inspired deference. Her reputation was ironclad. On the other side was Jasmine Crockett, underestimated by nearly everyone outside her circle of supporters, dismissed by critics as too bold, too loud, or too raw. Jasmine entered this trial with little more than her voice, her principles, and the resilience that had carried her through every battle before. She wasn't supposed to win the war of perception against a sitting judge. She wasn't supposed to shift the narrative. She wasn't even supposed to last in this chamber. To Barrett's allies, Jasmine was nothing more than an ambitious newcomer, to be mocked, minimized, and discarded. But beneath the surface, this wasn't a clash of resumes. It was a collision of identities. Barrett represented the gatekeepers of power, those who believed the system belonged to them and always would. Jasmine represented the voices often spoken over, the Americans told to wait their turn, too quiet, down, to stop asking for too much. This wasn't about statutes and clauses. It was about belonging. No. About who gets to claim America's story and who gets written out of it. That was why the cameras were everywhere. Why millions tuned in. And why every phrase spoken in that chamber rippled outward into the nation's bloodstream. This trial had stopped being about the specifics of a case long ago. It had become symbolic. The stakes could not have been higher. If Barrett humiliated Jasmine, it would not simply be a victory of one woman over another. It would send a message that power always crushes dissent, that the old order remains unshaken, that dignity has no place when arrogance decides to sneer. But if Jasmine held her ground, if she responded not with weakness but with unbreakable clarity, then the story would change. It would prove that silence could be strength, that composure could dismantle cruelty, and that truth could still stand in the face of ridicule. Reporters scribbled furiously. Pundits whispered predictions in hushed corners of the gallery. Even the jurists in the chamber leaned forward ever so slightly, sensing the weight of the moment. The question was no longer whether Barrett would dominate the exchange, it was whether Jasmine could survive it. And if she did, what would that survival mean for the millions who saw their own lives reflected in her? For every immigrant family told they didn't belong, for every young woman underestimated in boardrooms and classrooms, for every voice laughed at before it was heard, this trial was theirs. Barrett seemed confident she already knew the answer. Her attacks carried the smugness of inevitability, the calm of someone who had never truly been challenged. To her, Jasmine was a formality, a stepping stone. A brief annoyance before the headlines crowned her victorious once again. But history has a way of turning when arrogance grows to certain. And in that chamber, as Barrett's words dripped with scorn, the silence before Jasmine's reply grew heavier. No one expected that a single sentence would change the tone of the entire courtroom. Long before the clash with Jasmine Crockett, Judge Amy Coney Barrett had cultivated an image of composure and control. To her admirers, she was brilliant, unshakable, and the embodiment of a disciplined mind rooted in tradition.
Ow.
To her critics, she was the face of a system that cloaked arrogance and civility. A gatekeeper who used the language of law to silence the voices that most needed to be heard. Barrett's reputation had not been built overnight. It was forged in hearings, rulings, moments where she managed to present herself as the calm authority towering over chaos. She preached fairness, often reminding audiences that justice must remain blind, that the scales should never tip in favor of passion over principle. Yet time and again, those who stood on the other side of her questions, her rulings, or her carefully worded dismissals found themselves treated not as equals in debate, but as inconveniences in her courtroom. For Barrett, fairness seemed to apply to institutions, not individuals. To abstract ideals, not to the living, breathing people who bore the weight of her decisions. It was this contradiction that defined her career. On paper, she was impartial. In practice, she wielded condescension as a weapon, a tool to remind challengers of their place. She rarely raised her voice, rarely lost her temper, and rarely descended into open conflict.
Instead,
her power came from the sharp precision of words meant to slice away the confidence of those who dared stand opposite her. She had perfected the art of undermining with a smile. When younger politicians, especially women and people of color, crossed her path, the pattern was clear. Barrett spoke of decorum, but delighted in belittling. She spoke of equality, but projected superiority. She framed herself as a servant of justice, while reinforcing the very hierarchies that kept challengers like Jasmine perpetually underestimated. For Barrett, that wasn't hypocrisy, it was simply the natural order. Her rise within the judiciary had only strengthened that sense of inevitability. Colleagues deferred to her. Commentators often portrayed her as unassailable. And to her supporters, she was more than a judge. She was a symbol of preservation, of holding back the tide of change that so many feared. Every ruling she delivered, every pointed comment she made, became part of the mythology of Amy Coney Barrett, the judge who would not bend. But mythologies often obscure the cracks. Barrett's confidence, so admired by her allies, was also her greatest blind spot. She believed she could not be rattled. She believed every challenger would stumble under her stare, buckle under her questions, and falter against her certainty. What she could not imagine was someone meeting her scorn, not with anger or desperation, not with silence and control of force she could not dismiss. Because silence speaks in ways arrogance cannot answer. In the weeks before the trial, Barrett's remarks about Jasmine were telling. Offhand comments laced with mockery, subtle suggestions that Crockett was unprepared, too inexperienced, and out of her depth. To Barrett, Jasmine was simply another name to be filed away after a moment of condescension. She had reduced Jasmine to a caricature before the trial even began, believing that the battle was already won, and this, more than anything, fueled the anticipation among spectators. People tuned in not only to watch Barrett speak, but also to see how far she would go in asserting her dominance. For many, it was theater, a spectacle of power reaffirming itself. For others, it was infuriating but predictable. The continuation of a pattern where voices like Jasmine's were dismissed before they could ever be heard. Barrett entered the trial with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of being told you are beyond reproach. The robe was more than fabric. It was armor. The bench was more than wood. It was a throne. She carried the authority of someone who had never truly been forced to account for her own contradictions. To her, victory was already written. And Jasmine was just a footnote in the story of her career, but arrogance has a way of blinding those who wield it. The very confidence that had made Barrett formidable also left her vulnerable. She could not see how the ground beneath her was shifting. She could not feel how her words, once commanding, now carried a tone of entitlement that grated against the ears of a changing audience. She could not recognize that her performance of strength was beginning to look less like discipline and more like disdain. Barrett had the power, the gavel, the robe, the authority of years, and the weight of precedent. But as history has shown time and again, power alone does not guarantee victory. She had the power. But power alone doesn't guarantee victory. Before Jasmine Crockett ever stepped foot into the courtroom where Amy Coney Barrett's words would come crashing down upon her, she had already lived 1,000 battles. None of them were easy. None of them were designed for her to win. From the beginning, Jasmine was underestimated not just by political opponents, but by the very structures that claimed to value fairness and equality. She grew up in a world that loved to remind her of its ceilings, its barriers, and its unspoken rules about who belonged at the table and who should remain silent at the door. Her childhood wasn't lined with privilege or the quiet protection of wealth. It was forged in neighborhoods where opportunity often felt like a locked gate. But Jasmine learned early on that locked gates don't mean you turn around, they mean you climb higher. Teachers doubted her. Classmates whispered that she was too outspoken, too loud, and too stubborn. But for Jasmine, her voice was never a weakness. It was survival. She discovered that when you were told to be quiet long enough, speaking up becomes not just defiance but duty. That duty carried her through law school, where again she was reminded she didn't quite fit the mold. Professors praised her intellect, but warned her that passion would get in the way of credibility. Colleagues advised her to tone it down, to soften her edges, to blend in. Yet Jasmine knew that edges were not flaws, they were weapons. And she would need every one of them if she was to make it in a world that wasn't built for her success. Her career began not in halls of power, but in cramped offices. Late nights and cases nobody else wanted. She defended those who couldn't afford high-powered lawyers. She stood by people whose names never made headlines, whose lives were considered expendable. She fought for the forgotten not because it was easy, but because it was right. And each case carved something deeper into her: resilience. The resilience to keep going when the odds screamed otherwise. Politics came almost by accident. She never set out to climb the ladder of titles and positions, but she saw how broken the system was from the outside. She realized that shouting at the gates wasn't enough. You had to step inside. That meant running for office. That meant standing on stages where people looked at her like she was too small for the role, too inexperienced for the fight, and too different to be taken seriously. The campaigns were brutal. Money was short. Opposition was fierce. She lost before she won, and stumbled before she stood tall. And yet each setback became another layer of armor. Each insult hurled her way, made her sharper, quicker, and more ready for the next blow. People mocked her for daring to aim higher. She smiled, remembering every classroom where she was told to be quiet. She had never listened then. She wasn't going to start now. When she finally claimed her seat in Congress, Jasmine carried with her not just the pride of victory, but also the weight of responsibility. She was not there to play the role of politician as usual. She was there to fight. to speak for those who had been silenced, to demand space where space had never been given, to remind the powerful that they were not untouchable. In that mission, more than ambition, is what brought her into the same room as Amy Coney Barrett. By the time Barrett's attack echoed through the chamber, Jasmine had already been prepared by years of dismissal, of condescension, of being told she did not belong. The sting of being underestimated was not new, it was the drumbeat of her life. What Barrett thought was a crushing blow was, to Jasmine, familiar ground. She had stood in that place before, facing those who doubted her, and each time she had risen. Every scar, every bruise from the fights that came before, had been sharpening her for this moment. She had learned patience when the world demanded anger. She had learned composure when others tried to rattle her spirit. She had learned to let her silence breathe long enough to make the powerful nervous. And when the time came, she knew exactly how to speak so that her words did more than defend, they transformed. That was why the nation leaned forward, eyes glued to the woman who had just been attacked. They didn't see weakness in her stillness. They saw the story of someone who had been through too much to break now. They saw the strength of resilience, the dignity of survival, and the power of an underdog who had fought for every inch of the ground she stood on. Barrett thought she had cornered Jasmine. That arrogance could suffocate dignity. But Jasmine had been here before, again and again, in different forms and different places. The trial wasn't just another battle, it was the culmination of all of them. And this time, she wasn't fighting for herself alone. She was carrying the voices of every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. Every scar, every battle had prepared her for Barrett's attack. The chamber was no longer a courtroom. It had become an arena. Every sentence from Amy Coney Barrett landed like a jab, sharp and deliberate, designed to bruise not just Jasmine Crockett's arguments, but her very sense of belonging. You posture as though your convictions are carved in stone, Barrett sneered, her voice calm but edged with venom. But the moment they meet scrutiny, they collapse into dust. That is the difference between experience and impulse. You argue as though you've lived through the storms of law. You haven't. You've only played at it. The words cut through the air, drawing gasps and murmurs. Barrett's tone was surgical, practiced, and honed over years of silencing challengers with a flick of disdain. Her gaze was fixed on Jasmine like a predator studying its prey. She pressed on, her questions less about inquiry than humiliation. If you cannot even grasp the basic precedent in this matter, Barrett continued, why should anyone trust you to weigh in on issues that shape this nation? Why should your voice carry the same gravity as those who've earned their seat through decades of work? Every camera swiveled to Jasmine, desperate to capture the flicker of collapse. But Jasmine sat steady, hands folded, her expression unshaken. She did not interrupt. She did not flinch. She absorbed every word like a boxer letting an opponent tire themselves with blows that never quite land. Her silence was its own kind of reply, measured, deliberate, and unnerving. The rhythm began to form. Barrett attacked. Jasmine absorbed. Barrett's voice rose, and Jasmine's calm deepened. The more one lunged, the more the other anchored. It was not the dynamic Barrett expected, and that subtle shift began to show. Her voice, once steady, grew sharper, her phrasing quicker, and her patience thinner. Do you think justice is a performance? Barrett snapped, leaning slightly forward, her robe pulling tight against the bench.
Ow.
Do you think sound bites are enough to carry the burden of truth? This isn't a stage. Congresswoman, it's the law, and the law doesn't bend for applause. The gallery stirred again. Some shook their heads in agreement. Others sat rigid, sensing the cruelty behind the veneer of judicial authority. A young woman in the back row whispered, "She's pushing too hard." Still, Jasmine said nothing. Her eyes were locked on Barrett, steady and unwavering, as though every insult passed through her without finding purchase. And that silence began to gnaw at Barrett. What was supposed to look like dominance now risked appearing like desperation. Barrett tightened her jaw. "Answer me," she demanded, her tone sharper than before. "Defend yourself. Surely you have something to say." But Jasmine didn't move. Her stillness became a mirror, reflecting Barrett's fury back at her, exposing the cracks in the mask of composure. Porter's pens scratched across paper, capturing every detail of the unraveling. Photographers leaned in for the shot, Barrett's impatience against Jasmine's calm. Seconds stretched long. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was pressure, a living, pulsing presence that seemed to squeeze the room. The crowd leaned forward, breath shallow, waiting for something, anything to break it. Barrett tried again, voice faltering between control and agitation. Well, have you nothing to say? Or do you concede that your arguments collapse under the weight of real law? That was when the shift became undeniable. Barrett was no longer the untouchable figure towering above the peed chamber. She was a woman demanding validation from someone who refused to give it. The power dynamic had flipped, though Barrett didn't yet realize it. The audience did. The cameras did. The nation watching at home did. And then Jasmine leaned forward, and the room fell silent. Jasmine's movement was almost imperceptible at first. A slow lean forward, her hands unfolding as if to release the weight of the silence she had carried. The gallery seemed to exhale all at once, the tension of minutes collapsing into that single shift of posture. Barrett's eyes narrowed, sensing a reply was finally coming, though she still wore the confidence of someone expecting an easy rebuttal to crush. But Jasmine's calm did not crack, it expanded. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, didn't need to be. It was deliberate and clear. Every syllable chosen, as though she had been sculpting the sentence for years. Judge Barrett, she began, her tone steady, you accuse me of noise, but noise is what fills a room without meaning.
What?
I speak what I've always spoken as substance born from the people who live with the consequences of decisions made in chambers like this one. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The sentence was simple, but it cut through the chamber's air like a blade through silk. Jasmine did not raise her voice. She let her words sit, demanding their own gravity. Barrett shifted slightly, a flicker. In her composure? Substance, she repeated, attempting to scoff. Your rhetoric, but Jasmine continued, unhurried, letting the interruption die under the weight of her poise. You talk of decades of law, Judge Barrett, decades of precedent, but precedent is not perfection. Precedent once told us that women could not vote, that black children could not share schools with white children, that immigrants would never belong here. Precedent has preserved injustice as often as it has corrected it. A murmur surged through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras snapped, and even some of Barrett's allies shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine paused, allowing the words to land, her gaze steady on Barrett. The judge's lips tightened, her fingers gripping the bench as though steadying herself. You ask why my voice should carry the same gravity as those who have sat here for decades? Jasmine continued, her tone sharp but calm. Because truth does not age into validity. Truth is truth the moment it's spoken. Whether by someone with centuries of power behind them or by someone who had to claw her way into this room, the room trembled with silence. Barrett opened her mouth, then closed it again, as though the expected rebuttal had evaporated. Jasmine had given no opening to strike. Another pause. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her hands folding again, a composure so deliberate it made Barrett's restlessness grow more visible. And then Jasmine pressed on, each phrase layered with precision. You say, I haven't weathered the storms of law. You're right. Judge Barrett, I haven't spent my life shielded by robes and benches. My storms came in classrooms where my voice was dismissed, in neighborhoods where my neighbors were told opportunity wasn't theirs, and in courtrooms where clients without money were treated as less than human. Those storms were not theoretical. They lived. The audience erupted with murmurs of approval, a few nodding openly. Barrett shot a glance across the room, but even her allies now sat stiff, unwilling to meet her gaze. And yet, Jasmine said, her voice softening, those storms taught me something your gavel never could. That law without humanity is nothing but a weapon wielded by the powerful. And humanity is not noise, it is the only substance that matters. Barrett's jaw tightened. She tried to interject, but Jasmine held up a hand, not with aggression, but with quiet authority that stilled the air. The cameras caught at this. a moment where the underdog halted the judge without raising her voice. "You say, I should be grateful for this seat." Jasmine went on, her eyes narrowing with quiet fire. "I am grateful, Judge Barrett, not to you, but to the people who put me here. The families who entrusted me with their struggles, the immigrants who asked me to carry their hope, and the young women who told me, don't let them silence you. My gratitude is to them, not to those who believe access is a gift granted from above." The words hit hard, and a sharp intake of breath swept the chamber. Barrett's face flushed, her practiced composure faltering. Jasmine let the silence stretch again before her final strike. She spoke slowly, each phrase cutting deeper. "You say this isn't a stage, but it is. Every chamber, every courtroom, every seat of power is a stage where the American story is performed. The question isn't whether it's a stage, it's whose story gets told. And today, Judge Barrett, it is not yours alone. It is ours." Gasps. Audible gasps. Reporters clutched, their pens tighter, their notes almost frantic. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer. Desperate to capture Barrett's first visible crack, her lips pressed so tightly they lost color, her shoulders rigid against the weight of Jasmine's words. Then Jasmine leaned in one final time, her voice lowering so that everyone had to lean forward to catch it. "The law doesn't bend for applause," you said. "You're right, but it also doesn't bend for arrogance. It bends for justice. And justice isn't yours to grant. It belongs to the people." The chamber erupted not with applause, for decorum held, but with a living energy, a wave of murmurs and suppressed exclamations. It was as if the entire room had been waiting for someone to finally say aloud what millions had been whispering beyond its walls. Barrett sat back, visibly rattled, her confidence fractured. The robe that once seemed to shield her now felt like a weight. For the first time, she looked smaller, not in stature, but in certainty. Jasmine, by contrast, seemed to glow. Her calm radiated like armor polished by truth. She did not gloat, did not smirk, and did not revel in the takedown. She simply sat back, steady, knowing that the moment spoke louder than any further words could. The courtroom was no longer Barrett's stage. It belonged to Jasmine. Her words didn't just defend her, they exposed Barrett. It began the way these moments always do, quietly, like a spark that no one realizes is about to ignite a wildfire. A single clip of Jasmine's final words, "Justice isn't yours to grant. It belongs to the people," hit the timeline. It was only 12 seconds long, posted by a reporter still buzzing from the energy of the courtroom. Within minutes, the view count ticked upward, first by thousands, then tens of thousands. By the end of the hour, it had crossed 1 million. Hashtags were next. Hashtag justice belongs to the people.
Hashtag Jasmine Barrett.
Hashtag mic drop heard around the world. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, each platform lit up like a stage of its own. The country now an audience replaying the exchange on loop. Young organizers stitched the clip into montages of civil rights speeches, immigrant stories, and protest chants. Celebrities reposted it, some with fire emojis, others with captions like "THIS is leadership." The moment wasn't just circulating, it was exploding. News outlets scrambled to catch up. Cable networks replayed the clip with banners like Crockett's stunning courtroom response, and Barrett left speechless. Analysts debated in real time, had the balance of power shifted?
Yes.
Was this merely rhetoric, or the crystallization of a deeper cultural moment? On one network, a conservative pundit tried to downplay it, calling it grandstanding, only for their co-host to cut in. Grandstanding doesn't leave an entire courtroom in silence. That was different. The validation poured in, not from institutions, but from the people. Jasmine's words were being captioned in Spanish, Arabic, and Tagalog, shared in immigrant communities across the nation. Mother in Houston posted, "My daughter just watched Jasmine and said, 'That looks like us,'" a veteran tweeted. "For once, someone said the truth I fought for." In neighborhoods where politics had always felt like someone else's game, as Bresman's clip made it feel like the door was cracking open. Even her critics unwittingly amplified the moment. Barrett's defenders clipped the speech to attack it, but every repost only widened its reach. The attempt to dismiss Jasmine as performative backfired. The more they sneered. The more people saw Barrett's frown freeze in real time, her composure falter, and her authority punctured. What was meant as critique turned into fuel. By nightfall, Jasmine's face was everywhere. Memes crowned her the people's gavel. Digital artists painted her silhouette leaning forward, with the caption in bold, "Truth is truth the moment. It's spoken." Activists carried the phrase into real-world rallies, printing it on signs that waved in front of courthouses and state capitals the very next day. The cultural line had been drawn. America was not just reacting, it was choosing dignity over arrogance, choosing composure over condescension, choosing in that moment Jasmine over Barrett. For Barrett, the silence in the courtroom had been bad enough. The silence afterward was worse. Her allies issued statements, but they were cautious, brittle, and failing to resonate. They couldn't erase the clip now, etched into the nation's memory. Jasmine was calm, but Barrett was rattled. That image carried a symbolic weight greater than any transcript. And then came the op-eds, written at lightning speed. The new voice of justice. How one sentence shook the halls of power, from underdog to icon. Commentators compared Jasmine's words to watershed moments in American history, snapshots where dignity under pressure had changed public consciousness. By the second day, Jasmine wasn't just trending. She was a movement. Students wore her quotes on t-shirts. Late-night hosts replayed the exchange, their audiences roaring with approval. Musicians sampled her voice, weaving it into beats. Even the algorithms bent in her favor, pushing her clip onto feeds that had never once engaged with politics. But the most striking validation came not from celebrities or pundits, but from ordinary Americans. A factory worker in Michigan wrote, "I don't know all the laws, but I know respect when I see it." Jasmine showed it. Barrett didn't. A college freshman in California shared, "My mom always told me to keep my head down." Today she told me, "Maybe it's time to speak up." It was more than a viral moment. It was a mirror America was holding to itself and liking what it saw. And in the midst of this storm, Jasmine remained calm. She didn't bask, didn't gloat. When asked about the reaction, she said, "Only the people are the story, not me." That humility only deepened the resonance, amplifying her dignity against Barrett's brittle arrogance and ours. Jasmine's reply had left the courtroom and taken over the nation. And soon the weight of that moment would circle back, pressing. Not just on Barrett, but on the entire system she represented, in the end. It wasn't about Barrett's attack or Jasmine's defense. It wasn't even about who won a single courtroom exchange. What lingered, the part etched into memory, was something deeper, something larger than the walls that contained it. Jasmine took what had been hurled at her in contempt and reshaped it into a truth so undeniable that it no longer belonged to her alone. She turned arrogance into a mirror, reflecting back its hollowness for all to see. She turned condescension into contrast, making dignity shine brighter. What Barrett had meant as a weapon became a stage for something greater. Arrogance never defeats dignity, Jasmine would later say. And justice always outshines prejudice. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was lived truth. America has always wrestled with that balance. Those who hoard power versus those who demand fairness. And those who speak down versus those who rise up. In that courtroom, for a fleeting moment, the scales tipped visibly. People across the nation saw arrogance stripped bare, saw composure break through the noise, and saw truth refuse to bend. The story became bigger than two women. It became America's story. Immigrant child who stayed up late translating for her parents. Factory worker who held their head high while supervisors sneered. The student was told they didn't belong in the honors class. Each of them saw in Jasmine's composure a piece of themselves. They saw proof that dignity, though quieter than arrogance, could roar when the world was listening. Commentators called it a cultural flashpoint. But for ordinary people, it was something more intimate, a reminder that justice is not abstract, not unreachable. Justice is possible. Truth is stronger than spin. That is why the clip traveled beyond politics. It wasn't just left or right, conservative or progressive. It was human. It was the simple power of respect in the face of disrespect, courage against disdain. And when people saw that, they remembered something America often forgets, that the truest strength doesn't come from dominance, but from resilience. For Barrett, it was a bruising blow to her aura of invincibility. But for Jasmine, it was not triumph for its own sake. It was validation of every scar, every late night, every uphill battle she had endured to stand where she stood. It was proof that those struggles mattered not only for her, for all who had walked the same paths. The lesson echoed far beyond the courtroom. Dignity isn't weakness. Calm isn't surrender. Truth doesn't need volume to win, it needs conviction. And when conviction meets courage, even the most untouchable power can stumble. That was the gift of Jasmine's reply. It wasn't just that she flipped the trial upside down. It's that she reminded America of what it could still be. And for millions watching, it wasn't just history, it was hope. Barrett attacked with all the arrogance of someone certain she could not be touched. But Jasmine's reply flipped the trial, turned the room, and rewrote the narrative. History rarely remembers the aggressor, remembers the one who stood calm, who stood steady, who turned scorn into strength. And that is why, long after the echoes of Barrett's cutting words fade, it will be Jasmine Crockett's composure that lives on. Her silence before the storm, her clarity when she spoke, her dignity unshaken, shining brighter than every insult meant to diminish her. This is what America will remember, not the arrogance of power, but the resilience of truth. Not the woman who tried to belittle, but the one who showed that respect is mightier than contempt. That is the lesson etched into this moment. When arrogance meets dignity, dignity wins. When lies meet truth, truth endures. And now, story doesn't belong only to Jasmine, it belongs to you. To everyone who refuses to bow their head in the face of condescension, to everyone who knows that strength isn't measured in volume, but in conviction. So let this not be the end of the story. Let it be the spark. If you believe dignity outshines arrogance, truth always wins, then subscribe, share this story, and be part of this movement. Because moments like these are not just about politics, they're about us. Together, we decide what America remembers.